project planning and control, PP&C risk, execution and communication. Course 4, Module 4. Module 4 presents the full PP&C analysis checklist, the structured question set that converts monthly data review from reporting into a genuine assessment. These questions come directly from the working practice of Kevin Rice and Bill across JPL, Lockheed Skunk Works, and NASA centers over more than 70 combined years. They are not theoretical constructs. The checklist is organized by topic, funding, cost, workforce, schedule, subcontracts, reserves, and trends because different failure modes hide in different functional areas, and each area has its own diagnostic questions. Print this checklist and use it monthly. The value is in the habit, not in knowing the questions exist. In this module, we'll introduce a structured approach to conducting comprehensive program assessments. Rather than simply reporting data, you'll learn how experienced PP&C professionals ask the right questions to evaluate funding, cost, workforce, schedule, subcontractor performance, reserves, and program trends. We'll explore a proven analysis checklist that helps uncover hidden risks, validate assumptions, and identify issues that may not be visible in high-level reports. By the end of the module, you'll have a practical framework for turning data into meaningful insights that support informed program decisions. By the end of this module, you'll be able to move beyond simply reporting program data and begin thinking like an assessor. You'll learn how to use a structured checklist to evaluate every major aspect of program performance, identify hidden risks and emerging issues, recognize meaningful trends, and ask the questions that matter most. Most importantly, you'll develop the critical thinking skills needed to transform data into actionable insights that support informed leadership decisions and successful program execution. The W. Edwards Deming quote, "If you do not know how to ask the right question, you discover nothing," frames the entire purpose of the checklist module. The quality of the question determines the quality of the analysis. The Johns Hopkins ICU checklist story in the speaker notes is directly applicable. A simple, structured protocol applied consistently virtually eliminated a category of preventable deaths. The same principle applies to preventable cost and schedule overruns. The checklist does not make you smart. It makes you systematic. And systematic analysis catches things that smart but unsystematic analysis misses. The goal is to reach the point where the checklist questions are so thoroughly internalized that you ask them automatically, not because you are reading from a list. The checklist provides a structured path through analysis and assessment, organized by functional category, not a replacement for insight, but a guarantee against gaps. The functions covered, funding, cost, workforce, schedule, subcontracts, reserves, trends, correspond directly to the major sources of cost and schedule variance on development programs. The categories were not chosen arbitrarily. An analyst who can say after each monthly review that they applied all 7 category sets has done something most analysts have never done, a complete, structured pass through the program's risk picture. Work through the checklist in the same order every month. Consistency is what makes the trend patterns visible over time. Funding checklist questions focus on whether overruns on other programs could redirect your funding, whether the current funding profile still supports the project's cost and schedule plan, and whether termination liability to subcontracts has been properly considered. The effect of prime contract transition, where major contract recompetition changes the funding dynamics for related subcontracts, is one of the most disruptive and least anticipated funding risks on long-duration programs. Funding risk is different from cost risk in that it can originate entirely outside your program, through congressional action, portfolio-level decisions, or overruns on unrelated contracts of the same institution. Build a funding risk section into your monthly assessment, even when the numbers look stable. The questions in this category are specifically designed to catch external funding threats before they materialize. Forward funding into the next fiscal year requires specific analysis of whether the carryover supports a potential continuing resolution and what the current fund's exhaustion date is. Two numbers every analyst should be able to state on demand. The distinction between the management agreement and the agency baseline commitment and the accounting for funds that flow across directorates is where many budget execution errors originate. The expectation of funds availability and the actual availability are frequently misaligned. An analyst who cannot state the current fund's exhaustion date for their major contracts does not have a complete picture of the program's financial health, regardless of how good the cost analysis is. Know your fund's exhaustion dates. Update them monthly. Report them proactively to leadership rather than waiting for them to become a crisis. Cost checklist questions examine whether the funding profile matches the current cost and schedule plan, what cost expenditure percentages look like at key milestones, and whether cost ratios for key resources are within family for the mission type. The milestone-based spending benchmark, the example of spending 40% of the budget by CDR and asking whether that is good or out of the family, is exactly the kind of contextual question that separates assessment from reporting. Cost ratios like dollars per kilogram and dollars per what provide a technical performance context for cost analysis that purely financial metrics cannot. They connect the business data to the engineering reality. Identify the 2 or 3 cost ratios most meaningful to your specific program and track them monthly. Deviations from historical family patterns are among the earliest indicators of technical cost growth. Labor rate variance analysis. The situation where a planned high labor category is being filled with a lower category or vice versa is one of the most commonly missed cost drivers because it requires looking at both hours and rates simultaneously. The question of whether cost overruns are occurring to maintain the schedule or whether both cost and schedule are deteriorating simultaneously is the diagnostic question that separates recoverable situations from systemic problems. Margin trades. The cost implications of trading mass for power or other technical parameter exchanges represent a category of cost impact that does not appear in financial data until it is well underway. The checklist question forces early awareness. When cost variances arise, always first determine whether they are labor mix, rate, or performance-driven. Each has a different implication for the ETC, and each calls for a different response. Benchmarking key subsystem costs against similar programs and calculating implied EAC from the current burn rate are two of the most powerful forward-looking analytical tools in the cost checklist. The burn rate EAC calculation. If the monthly burn rate stays constant, does the remaining budget cover the remaining work? Is one of the simplest and most reliable early warning tools available. It requires only the current actuals and the contract value. The budgeted work-to-go concept, subtracting earned value from BAC to find remaining work, combined with actual monthly burn rate, gives a rough EAC that is often more accurate than the contractor's submitted estimate. Calculate the monthly burn rate implied by the EAC and compare it to the contractor's submitted EAC. When they diverge significantly, one of them is wrong. Uncertainty around cost obligation timing, subcontract cost accrual versus actual, discrepancies between project reporting and financial system data, and vendor capability analysis for sole source critical path suppliers are the 4 cost questions most frequently deferred and least frequently asked. Vendor capability analysis for sole source suppliers is particularly important. If the single source for a critical component fails to perform, there is no fallback, and understanding that risk before it materializes is the difference between a manageable problem and a program stopper. The gap between project reporting and financial system data is a data quality issue that undermines every analysis if it remains unaddressed. When the numbers tell different stories, find out which one is right before drawing conclusions from either. Identify the sole source critical path vendors for your program and develop a specific assessment protocol for each. Vendor capability analysis should be a standing agenda item at contractor reviews. Workforce checklist questions examine profile reasonableness, ramp patterns, front versus back loading, alignment with the funding profile, and whether staffing was driven by funding availability or work schedule requirements. The observation that projects tend to stay flat in the final 6 months rather than rolling off as planned is empirically reliable. Plan accordingly rather than forecasting a drop-off that history says will not materialize. Staffing to the funding profile rather than the work schedule is a subtle but significant analytical flag. It means the workforce is being sized to match available money rather than actual programmatic need, which creates hidden risk. When a workforce plan shows a significant drop-off in the final phase, apply the historical rule. Assume it will not happen and model what that means for the ETC. Then decide whether the original plan deserves to be believed. Fractional FTE analysis and labor rate variance assessment are the two workforce questions most frequently skipped because they require connecting people-level data to cost-level data in ways that most reporting systems do not automatically facilitate. Fractional FTEs add up. A program with 40 people each billing at 0.8 FTE has a real workforce of 32, which has direct implications for schedule, productivity, and the EDC that are invisible in the headcount number. Senior versus junior composition changes affect not just cost, but also productivity. An experienced team member may accomplish more in the same hours as a junior replacement, which means labor category shifts affect technical performance as well as financial performance. Build a workforce composition dashboard that shows not just total FTEs, but the senior-junior technician breakdown. Changes in that distribution are early indicators of both cost and schedule risk. Schedule checklist questions examine historical family benchmarking, plan versus actual task start ratios, and task completion ratios. 3 questions that measure execution fidelity against the baseline rather than just date compliance. The ratio of planned task starts to actual starts is a more sensitive leading indicator than milestone slip. By the time a milestone slips, multiple individual task failures have already accumulated. The checklist question catches the accumulation early. Comparing actual task starts to planned task starts and comparing actual completions to planned completions are the BEI and CEI calculation from Course 3, expressed as checklist questions. The connection between the metrics and the questions is deliberate. If you built the BEI and CEI habits from Course 3, the scheduled checklist questions should feel like reinforcement. If you did not, use the checklist questions as the entry point into those metrics. The ratio of cost expended to complete tasks versus planned cost to complete those tasks, critical path consistency from period to period, and the effect of reserve utilization on schedule are the 3 deepest schedule questions on the checklist. The example plan was to spend $200K to complete 4 tasks, but only 3 were completed for $250K, capturing a compound problem that each metric individually would miss. Schedule is behind, cost is over, and efficiency is declining simultaneously. Critical path consistency is the schedule health question most analysts forget to ask. A critical path that changes monthly is a structural problem, not a scheduling adjustment. It means the network logic itself is unstable. Track critical path composition month over month, not just critical path dates. When the tasks on the critical path change frequently, the schedule indicates that something fundamental about the program's sequencing is unstable. Scope capture completeness, hardware delivery alignment, network logic validity, schedule health check status, cost schedule integration, WBS product orientation, and key driver risk alignment are the deep structural questions that validate whether the schedule is a real planning tool or a reporting artifact. The incompressible test list question, whether the test sequence is consistent with the schedule, is one of the most technically specific schedule checks and one of the most valuable. Integration and testing are where most schedule slips originate, and a test sequence that cannot fit within the allocated time is a launch risk from day one. The alignment between the project schedule and the line organization's internal schedule and specifically whether the connection between the two is documented and maintained, is where coordination failures that drive parallel schedule slips typically originate. If the schedule passes all 14 DCMA health check metrics but fails any of the questions on this slide, the schedule is not credible. Health checks test structure. These questions test reality. Subcontract checklist questions examine special provisions, directed change pricing status, facility-level changes at the subcontractor level, historical performance on similar programs, and cost-to-milestone alignment. The two contractor business change scenarios, losing other business, so key resources stay on your program longer, and winning new business, so key resources get pulled off, represent opposite risk directions that the same underlying condition can create, depending on which way the contractor's book moves. Directed changes to subcontracts that are not priced and included in the EAC or lien list are one of the most common sources of unexpected cost growth in the final phase of development programs. They accumulate quietly and emerge suddenly. Maintain a directed change log for every major subcontract. Review it monthly against the lien list. If there are changes in one that are not present in the other, the EAC is incomplete. Reserve checklist questions examine whether utilization has retired the specific risks on the risk list, what the burn-down percentage looks like at key milestones, whether utilization is consistent with design principles, and what category of use, scope change, growth, or risk buy-down the reserves are being consumed against. The distinction between reserves used for risk buy-down versus reserves used to cover growth is analytically critical. Buy-down reserves reduce the forward risk posture, while growth reserves simply cover what has already gone wrong without reducing future exposure. Design principles for reserve utilization. The expectation that specific percentages should remain at specific milestones are the benchmark against which actual burn-down should be compared. Without that benchmark, the burn-down number is context-free. Map every reserve drawdown to a specific risk register item or scope change. A reserve that cannot be traced to a specific source has been consumed for growth, which means the risk posture has not improved despite the spending. The primary trend questions focus on 3 to 6 month CPI, SPI, and SCI performance for key subsystems, workforce trends against plan, and EAC adequacy for the remaining scope, the three most forward-looking questions in the entire checklist. The 3-month horizon is the first indicator threshold, and the 6-month horizon is the no-kidding trend line. These numbers come directly from Kevin Rice's 30 years of practice. They are not arbitrary. The EAC sufficiency question is whether the estimate at completion is sufficient to complete the remaining scope, which is the question that all other trend analysis builds toward. Everything else is leading up to this answer. If you're not tracking CPI, SPI, and EAC trends on a rolling 3-month and 6-month basis, you're not doing trend analysis. You are doing monthly reporting. The distinction is the horizon. Subcontractor performance trends, cost versus schedule accomplishment alignment, and the cost-schedule interaction question. Are costs going up to buy schedule, or are both deteriorating? Round out the forward-looking trend picture. The question of whether costs are going up to maintain the schedule is one of the most important diagnostic questions in the entire checklist because it distinguishes two very different program situations with similar surface-level symptoms. A program spending more to protect the schedule is making a deliberate trade. A program in which both cost and schedule deteriorate simultaneously has a systemic execution problem. The trend question is what identifies the situation you are in. Never interpret a cost overrun without simultaneously examining the schedule trend. The two together tell the story. Either one alone can be misleading. Margin trade cost implications and key subsystem cost benchmarking against similar programs are the two trend questions that connect technical performance history to financial forecasting. The examples, reaction wheels, cryocoolers, and power supply, are not random. They are the subsystems that have driven the largest cost surprises on NASA development programs over the past 2 decades. Knowing where the historical pain points, is the starting point for trend analysis. When technical decisions trade one resource for another, mass for power, for example, the cost implication of that trade needs to be reflected in the forward cost trend. If it is not, the EAC is understated. Build a subsystem cost trend benchmarked against similar programs for each of the high-risk hardware categories on your program. Update it at each major milestone review and use it to challenge EAC submissions. Reserve burn down at CDR, subcontractor cost to milestone alignment, workforce cost schedule consistency, and corrective action implementation effectiveness complete the trend checklist, all forward-looking questions that close the analytical loop. The corrective action question: has the project implemented prior review findings, and what has been the cost and schedule impact, is the accountability question that most review cycles skip. Without it, the same problems recur. Risk matrix evaluation as a cost and schedule diagnostic. Specifically, whether the risk matrix has been used to assess cost and schedule implications is the integration check that connects risk management to financial management. At every program review, include a standing agenda item on the status of prior corrective actions. The answer to that question tells you more about program management culture than any metric on a dashboard. The checklist questions are designed for major flight projects, but are broadly applicable to any program in which cost and schedule are managed against the baseline. These questions constitute the right conversations to have during analysis and assessment. They are not a bureaucratic compliance requirement, but the distilled wisdom of what experienced practitioners have learned to ask over decades of program work. Demonstrating that you're thinking beyond the numbers into their meaning is the standard the checklist is designed to help you meet. Meeting that standard is what earns you a seat at the project management table. Make use of these questions. They are freely given. The analysts who internalize them and apply them consistently will be the analysts that programs call first when things get complicated. 3 questions test the core module 3 competencies: aggregate data limitation and Pareto application, reserve posture adequacy assessment, and the trend habit that prevents month 11 surprises. Q2 requires the student to identify what the colleague has not checked, not what they got wrong. It is a completeness question, not a correction question. Q3 requires naming a specific habit and a specific time window, not a general principle. All 3 questions reward students who have internalized the module rather than memorized it. The answers require applying frameworks to specific scenarios, which is the actual analytical task. Answer Q3 last. It is the most integrative question on the checklist module and the one most directly connected to the real-world cost of poor trend discipline. With the analytical toolkit complete, contract cost analysis, budget execution, and a structured checklist in place, the final analytical challenge is communication, ensuring that the insights produced by that toolkit actually reach the people who need to act on them. The phrase, "even the most accurate assessment can fall short if it is not clearly conveyed," is the core tension of Module 5. Technical accuracy without communicative clarity is a partial success at best and a failure at worst. Poor communication of a correct assessment is just as damaging as a well-communicated incorrect one in terms of decision outcomes. Both result in the decision-maker acting on incomplete or misunderstood information. Module 5 is not a soft skills supplement to the analytical content. It is the delivery mechanism for everything that came before it. Without it, none of it reaches the people who need it.